All right, so here we are in part 2. Now we're going to begin to talk about the economic boom of the 1950s and the creation of suburbs. So the big picture of the post-war United States, post-World War II, is that American history since 1945 has been dominated by the relationship between Americans and their national government. The federal government would take on a much greater role in the everyday lives of Americans, from their educations to the economy that came to define American life. As historians, we will think about the benefits and also the costs of this increased federal role in American lives. Were federal interventions in the economy, in housing, in protecting civil rights successful? Did they have unintended consequences? So the Cold War may have been terrifying, but it was also the best economic times in American history. We will see what kind of society developed in the mass consumer age. And I have a lot of really cool pictures this week, like this family fallout shelter. From 1900 to 1940, 5 to 7% of 18 to 22-year-olds attended college. From 1950, starting in 1950, 50% of 18 to 22-year-olds attend college. It's a revolution in participation in higher education. Why? Think for a minute about our World War II lecture and remember the GI Bill. The federal subsidy that is the 1944 GI Bill creates a 25-year-long effect, and that is why there's such a jump in education, because that was a provision of the GI Bill. This is also a really great slide about being a secretary and how great it is. So the key role for the federal government in the post-war boom is not just puffing up the economy through direct war and relief spending, but long-term key interventions in worker productivity and in infrastructure. Federal interventions became essential to the working of the American economy, especially in housing and education. The federal government would pick winners in the post-war years and subsidize an entirely new way of living. In 1945, the longest sustained economic boom in American history began. It lasted from 1945 to 1970. The average annual growth of the U.S. economy from 1945 to 1972 is 3.72%, so the economy doubles in size every 11 to 12 years. There were 3 causes for this economic boom: the war, savings, and productivity. So growth begins due to the highly increased federal spending, right? Federal wartime spending was $100 billion. That was half of the gross national product of $200 billion. So compare that to the biggest New Deal budget in 1936, which was $8 billion. The war spending is massive Keynesian spending, and it ends the Depression. The federal spending, especially military spending, remains extremely high for the rest of the 20th century. In terms of savings, World War II leads to higher incomes, but nowhere to spend it because of rationing, so Americans save money. In 1945, Americans possessed $140 billion in saving bonds and bank accounts. As they spent their war gains on cars, houses, new consumer goods, they helped start a consumer boom. So think about like a show like Mad Men, where you had advertising coming in really in just large amounts during this period, because they're advertising to make people buy stuff that they don't need, all these luxury products. And economists notice. So the policy of the New Deal does not end the Depression, but spending for war and then the creation of and the spending on consumer goods does end the war. This leads to a new economic orthodoxy: the idea that governments don't keep economies healthy, consumers do. This shift from a producer-oriented to a consumer-oriented economics has its drawbacks. Is a society based on consuming things a healthy society? That's a question that many people ask during and after this period, and even now. It also ignores the largest reason for the post-war economic boom. The largest source of post-war growth is productivity. New investments, spending, and savings accounts for perhaps a third of post-war growth. The largest gain is due to increased productivity of American workers. And part of this shift from low productivity environments to high productivity work is what is reflected in this economic change. So in 1940, 15 to 20% of workers are in agriculture. In 1970, only 2 to 3% of workers are in agriculture. But the biggest productivity gain is due to a more skilled workforce. The education of workers accounts for nearly 1/3 of that annual growth. So remember, we had our educational revolution, right? In 1950, it's a jump from 5 to 7% in 1900 and 1940 to 50% in 1950 of 18 to 22-year-olds attending college. So think about that. That's going to create some stuff. We'll see the student movement come about in the next week. That's going to have to do with the larger proportion of people in college. And the post-war boom and consumerism and, the federal booms of the GI Bill in terms of housing and education are going to change how people live. So by 1960, the average American's income, adjusted for inflation, was 35% higher than in 1945, which in turn was 27% higher than in 1940. So an American way of life, and that's in quotes because it's this kind of idea, emerged in the post-war period. This way of life was defined by home ownership, steady, well-paid work, often as part of a labor union, and especially by consumer spending for cars, televisions, and home appliances. By 1956, Americans were buying 20,000 television sets per day, and 2 out of 3 families owned at least one TV set. So what did TV mean? Well, television foreshadows a shift that is going to take place from public life to private life. And it also plays into anti-communist hysteria and new ideas about domesticity. Each of these 3 facets was new, but none was newer than where and how people lived. So, here is the Ford Falcon Manufacturing and Management Team. So this is your steady, well-paid work as part of a labor union. Here is your consumer spending for cars, televisions, and home appliances. And let's talk about who lived in the suburbs, right? Okay, with that home ownership, that third piece. So the 1950s family was not the last gasp of the traditional family, as many people think it is. Rather, it was a radically new family that attempted to create a home that would fill all physical, emotional, and material needs. This is when we see the family room. The family room is invented in the 1950s to promote togetherness. It's a triumph of private space over public space. And the Cold War was very much a part of these social changes. Americans increasingly defined life as private in contrast to communism, which was political and public. The nuclear family in the suburban home was the cornerstone of Cold War society. It represented the security and success to those who had survived depression and World War II. It is still mythologized today by Americans who yearn for a simpler time in which sex was simpler and morals were simpler. The problem with this Hollywood image of the 1950s is that it ignores how the 1950s really were. For example, women increasingly worked. Life was incredibly stressful. People were living under the shadow of the bomb constantly. It was an era of segregation and racial oppression. And life was definitely not simpler in terms of sex or of morality. The foundation of the baby boom, for example, was sex. Americans were having sex at an earlier age, causing them to have more children. 1/3 of American women were married by the age of 19 in the year 1951. Early marriage meant more babies. The birth rate for fourth children, a fourth child, tripled between 1940 and 1960. The population grew by 20% in the 1950s, and by 1960, 1/3 of the nation's population was under 14 years old. This birth rate is similar to Kenya's birth rate today. So sex wasn't repressed. This was a highly sexualized era. Music and clothing and ads like this were extremely suggestive, but sex was contained through marriage. This is my favorite image. Selling coffee with violent sexualized images. So, For the majority of American women, their sexual initiation took place within the framework of marriage. The married population grew from 60% in 1940 to 66% in 1950 to 68% in 1960. Not being married made you suspect. The 1955 movie The Tender Trap declared that a woman isn't a woman until she's been married and had children. For both sexes, there were social pressures to marry, but the consequences of remaining unmarried were far less serious for men than they were for women. The man who failed to marry or stay married might be judged a little odd. The woman might be impoverished for life. What was at stake for women in the battle of the sexes was a stake on some man's wages. Men earned money and women did not. Women could not get well-paid career jobs. American society preserved the idea of the family wage and family wage jobs for male breadwinners. For men, this meant women and children were totally dependent on their wages alone, which for men created tremendous pressure. For women, this meant they made their living by marrying men. As one observer put it, quote, "Man's job is to support the army of unemployed women." So the dark secret behind the drive to get married was that women could not afford not to get married. Marriage was portrayed as romance, but underneath was a desperate financial need and an enormous resentment. So something to think about and something we can talk about in class this week is what were the consequences of such early marriage and of supersizing the American family? What were the consequences for women or for men? So we often assume that the 1950s were terrible for women. My grandmother would certainly agree, but were they so great for men? The 1950s family was not the last gasp of the traditional family. It was a radically new family. Another thing I want to point out is childhood. This is around the time that childhood is invented. There are more protections for children in terms of labor and schools and things like that. And this is when you get the idea of innocent children and childhood during this period. So that's also a new change to the family. And in the next part of the lecture video, the final part, we will talk about the Cold War, which was very much a part of these social changes. So that is going to be in part 3.